Hello everybody and welcome to another video, and today we're going to talk about scale creep. This is a thing that my co-host from Warhammer Weekly, Tom, likes to talk about a lot and deride as sort of a thing that's happening. And ultimately he speaks about it in a negative fashion, as in he doesn't like it. But I think two things. One, yes, it is happening. I don't think there's any argument that when we're talking about either the industry in general or Games Workshop in specific, there is some scale creep. Though exactly how much and what all it's impacting, I think you could, have some finer point discussions about. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about scale creep. So basically, my argument is going to be, yep, it's happening, and also, it's a good thing. So let's just get into it. All right, so let's go back to the beginning. So early fantasy miniatures, the early, fantasy wargaming, obviously grew out of historicals. Historical miniatures have been around for a long time, a long time. Now, they sort of changed sometime in the 60s or 70s to become more uniform, be packaged more of a game. The idea of, collecting historical miniatures or having, cavalry models or stuff like that goes back centuries. But sometime in the 60s or 70s, they became more uniform. There sort of became a set number of scales. There's probably some of this even going on before that, honestly. But in my mind, that's when it really became popularized. So when Fantasy Wargames started, they were drawing on a lot of the same technology. I mean, just the people who had the expertise were people who had cast historical miniatures before in a lot of ways. If you think of the early days of the industry, it's not like there was no previous way that these sculptors and people designing these minis could have cut their teeth, right? They came up in historicals. And so when you look at the scales, there was a lot of different scales in historical minis represent. They're still around to this day. 6 and 10 millimeter and 15 millimeter and so on. And when the early sort of fantasy game makers wanted to make figures, they went for a larger scale because they wanted more detail. They wanted the miniatures to have more sort of individuality and character because of the nature of what it was, a fantasy game. And the picture I have over on the right side here is actually from 1990, but it's still very much in that 80s style. It's the, sort of dwarf slayers at the time. The noticeable difference about fantasy models and the way they were designed is they had these larger heads, larger hand, oversized weapons. If you've ever held a historical miniature next to say a Games Workshop miniature, and say they both have a lance or a sword in their hand, you'll notice that the swords or the fists holding it tend to be oversized vis-a-vis, normal human proportions. And that's usually on purpose. Even more quote-unquote realistic fantasy miniatures still often do this to a small degree just because it makes it easier to sculpt, and that's where a lot of the detail and attention on the figure is drawn. When the figures first started, they called them 25 millimeter, which was sort of drawing on an existing scale, but it didn't have a 1 to X ratio, 156, 148, in as much. It didn't really line up to one of those exactly perfectly. Mainly because of these slightly different proportions. Also, when these fantasy miniatures originally came out, the measurement for 25 millimeter was, the idea was basically it was supposed to be the scale of the thing of an average height person, so a human being in 25 millimeter scale, was measured from that's the right height, from the sole of their feet to the top of their head. That's your average 6 foot tall human. In this scale, it'd be at that 25 millimeter point. That's how tall they are, etc. So dwarves would be shorter on that scale, and ogres larger, and whatever. The problem with it is that fantasy miniatures have a lot more junk on their heads often than some historical miniatures. Not all. There's some with Roman periods, big centurions and stuff or whatever with the crest and whatnot, but it became harder to do that. So the new standard became from the sole of the foot to the eye line. And over time, what happened is that started to kind of creep. So like I said, these are still very much in the 80s style. They're made in 90, but they're still very much living that 80s style. I'm sure if you've seen 80s goblins or orcs or whatever, it all has a very similar aesthetic to it. So these kept getting pushed just slightly throughout the 90s until eventually GW just moved everything to 28 millimeter, which again didn't really. They just sort of basically said this is the new scale, right? So I really like this picture because on the right, the top picture, because it shows you the eye line thing I'm talking about. So the Reaper Mini is a true 25 millimeter, and it's again it's just slightly out of proportion, but not so much. The sword is actually a fairly normally correct proportion for a short sword, though it's a little fatter than it should be, that kind of thing. You know, the blade would be thinner. But that eye line's sort of right at that 25 millimeter from the sole to the eyes. And next up, you've got the blind augur or whatever from Mordheim. So that's, you know, again, late 90s figure, but it was still very much into the 28 millimeter or heroic 28 millimeter scale, which is what we eventually started calling it. And the heroic 28 millimeter basically meant, yes, it's still the eye line's sort of at 28 on average, but models are often posed in bigger ways. They have oversized weapons, oversized hands. Their proportions weren't always exactly true, and some figs were just bigger because they were meant to represent sort of larger characters in the world. And even you can see that in the late 90s and early 2000s, people started pushing it. So like the last figure in that top picture is Rackham, who, so Rackham, obviously they're not around anymore. They made a lot of beautiful, albeit unfortunately metal minis. But this is one of my favorite minis they ever made. It's just a stunningly gorgeous model. And you can see the eye line for that model is basically right at 30 millimeters. Okay. So even there was, you know, newer companies were coming up. And what Rackham was known for was these incredibly detailed sculpts, right? This beautiful modeling. Now, part of that was because they recruited and had immense talent in their modeling department. All throughout, because their concept art, if you ever see that and stuff, was all just stunning as well. So from conception to execution, their models were gorgeous. But moving that up just a few millimeters makes a big difference. The amount of detail you could sculpt by hand on say a 15 millimeter fig versus a 25 millimeter fig versus a 30 millimeter fig is very different. In the same way, if you think how much easier it is to paint something that's just slightly larger. If you've ever painted an ogre and they're slightly like oversized expressions and hands and faces, you probably found it easier than, you know, painting like a smaller, older human fig. Think about doing things like picking out eyes or getting small details in there. And think about the amount of accoutrement, etc. on there. So the bottom picture is actually my minis. So on the left is an old 5th edition Bretonnian Knight I have sitting somewhere in a collection. I've got a bunch of these old knights. So that's, you know, 5th edition was squarely in the mid to late 90s there. It was obviously out of the box set. The 5th edition, well known for having the Bretonnians versus Lizardmen starter box. Yeah, that very popular battle combination. And then obviously next to it is the knights that came out in the 2000s around the launch of the new book, when you had the new, you know, Knights of the Realm box. And you can look at the proportions on that. So those two represent 10 years-ish difference in time. I mean, not exactly, obviously, but close enough for our purposes today. And you can look at the difference in detail that they were able to sculpt between those two. And also, just as somebody who has painted both of these, I will say that slight difference really does make a huge deal in being able to paint the figure. Just consider things like, it's the smallest details that make a difference, but consider the items like the tiny little fleur-de-lis on the base of his lance, right above his hand. Okay? Being able to easily get at something like that without it being able to, one, place it on the figure, and two, then being able to actually paint the thing. Or the little wrapping of fabric around the top of his head, right above the metal of his helm, but below the dragon. Having that wrapping actually have clear and distinct portions to it, like you can see the different wrappings, so you can do the color pick out like I did there. All right, I really like that knight. I think he came out fun. And as this goes on, we're going to see slight changes. So again, the picture right beside the knights, we've got two different models. Now, those are my Witch Elves converted into Daemonettes, but the rightmost one is the Juan Diaz sculpt, which is, if memory serves, it's like 2003, 2004. I'm sure somebody in the comments will correct me to exactly when they were, but they were early 2000s, versus the Daemonette box, or the Witch Elf box set. Sorry. The Witch Elf box set, the new Witch Elves, which are obviously, a more recent kit in the scheme of things. Now, immediately when you look at it, the Witch Elf looks a lot bigger. She's really not hugely different. The difference is, one, she's up on a rock. If you put their feet at the same height, they're actually about the same size, eye line-wise. But she has this incredibly overstated, sort of ridiculous hair. And even the claws that I gave her, right, which are because these are converted to be Daemonettes, if you think about the size of those claws versus an arm, those things are absolutely giant. But if you look at, like, their two legs, like, each of them are in the same position, which is why I kind of picked these two. If you look at their legs arcing into that sort of, I don't know, letter P pattern, right, both are about the same length. So the length of their legs and the amount they're jutting out is more or less equal. But the figure on the right, on the left, seems so much bigger because of a lot of the detail. So some scope creep can be nothing more than a sort of visual illusion because of details like the size of weapons or the size of things like hair or headdress or standing up on rocks, stuff like that. But as we get into the 2000s, things do change. So the status quo. Over the 2000s, realistically, most Games Workshop models stayed roughly the same size on average. There wasn't a huge amount of scope creep in the aughts. I'm not saying there's none. I'm saying that for the most part, model ranges, the size of models between 6th edition and, say, 8th edition stayed pretty consistent. But what really happened is it was a different type of movement. Like, sculptors started realizing that with big, powerful centerpiece models, we should start exploring making those actually larger and giving them a presence on the table, making them something that was worthy of how awesome they were supposed to be. So what this picture, and this is one of my favorite pictures of all time, is sort of those are all Bloodthirsters. Okay? The original one on the left is the very old Bloodthirster, followed up by the Bloodthirster from, like, I think he was modeled in the late 90s. He's probably still the Bloodthirster that was around standard up until the new Bloodthirster, which is the third model on the line, was made just here recently. And then, of course, you've got the big Forge World Bloodthirster, which if you've ever... as a side note, Forge World is terrible at selling you the real value of their kit. Their prices are high, but their pictures of their models are always just alone in a void. Like, I looked at this guy online before, and I was like, yeah, that's a neat-looking model. You don't realize, when you look at him alone, the monstrosity that this thing is. Look how massive that guy is. Forge World, you're doing a terrible job marketing. Terrible. You should have a regular human-sized figure in every single picture. All right, there. Rant over. Okay, anyways, my point being is that, so scale creep wasn't happening in this time period through where, like, suddenly all miniatures were kind of growing, much as they had the 90s. In the 90s, we very much had this move from, like, 25 to 28 to sort of 28 heroic, and there really was this sort of big movement. A popular example is, like, 80s orcs are as big as 2000s goblins. Okay. So that's really when that happened. But in the 2000s, I think that it happened more along the lines of these individual models, where companies realized, one, people were willing to pay more for big centerpiece models. Two, they could turn loose their sculptors, and, we'll talk about technology in a minute, but they could do these insane, oversized, massive, board-dominating creatures and it made it feel like it really was that thing. And three, they're fun. We like them. They sell for more. Everybody wins. For the most part. I mean, they get more expensive, and that is not always great, because it means that sometimes you can't afford them, which sucks. But for the most part, I think it's a positive move. All right, so let's talk about the latest releases. So now let's move into the Age of Sigmar stuff, which is what my co-host is always banging on about. So some of the new models are larger, but it's really not universal. So the first picture on the right are 3 generations or 3 different types of orcs. The very left one is your black orc, right? Next up is the brute, who's supposed to be like the bigger, arter guy above the black orc that was added with the Auric release. And then you've got the mega boss, the big boy, the sort of king daddy. Now, clearly the right 2 are larger, but they're larger because of sort of what they were going for with this release. Orcs always grow throughout their life. The more they fight, the bigger they get. It's always been a thing, but it's never really been recognized in a serious way until now. So they brought that piece to the fore. However, down below, you've got a picture of Fire Slayers mixed into... There's 2 different things there. One, in the back, you see Grim Burlixon with his little cog stuff. And in the front, the painted dwarves are Battle for Skull Pass dwarves. Now, the difference between the Fire Slayers and Grim Burlixon is non-existent. They're basically the same size. There's a couple different pictures of this with them standing right next to each other. They're the same size. If there's a difference, I can't spot it. It's got to be less than a millimeter. Proportions look the same. Size looks the same. There's clearly a slight difference between the Fire Slayers and the Battle for Skull Pass dwarves. So if you look at the guy with the shield and axe versus either of the 2 dwarves that are flanking him, there is clearly some small difference in size. But the reality is, and obviously the Fire Slayers are on a 32 millimeter base compared to the 25 millimeter for the Battle for Skull Pass dwarves. But he could be on a 25 mil, and he'd be more or less to the edges of the base, just like they are. In the end, if there's a scale creep there, that is extremely minimal. And by the way, Battle for Skull Pass is 10 years old at this point. Remember, the 2 knights I showed you were the same distance and time apart. And I would argue that the difference between those 2 knights is far more significant of a difference in size than these 2 dwarves. That would be certainly, and not only that, but detail and complexity. Like, I happen to think these 2 dwarves are both very nice sculpts. I think the Battle for Skull Pass dwarves look great. I think that the Fire Slayers look great. So what we see instead, I think, now, is it's not these models creeping over a previous incarnation. We had dwarves at a certain size, now they're slightly bigger. I don't think that's really the case for the most of this releases. I think what we're seeing is new models that are meant to be, that don't really have a previous version in the same way, and or are bigger when they can be, right? And I think this is continuing a long trend. I think that what you see with stuff like the Stormcast, the Varangard, the Auric Warboss is the sort of realization or the attempt to say, if these things are more elite, more special, more powerful, more whatever, then we're going to represent them by increasing their size some within the game. And to me, that's what's really going on. Not like everything is just scale creeping up and suddenly your collection is going to be much smaller, just dwarfed by these new minis. I don't buy it for a minute. I mean, if your collection is an 80s collection of goblins, and you put that with a current orc and goblin army of the most recent sculpts, yeah, they're going to look real different. But that's, 30 years apart, right? And so I'm not sure that's necessarily a fair measure of comparison. When I look at these dwarves, which are a decade apart, they seem like they fit together fine in the same army to me. If all those dwarves were ranked up or either in ranks or just in a block, in a skirmish group, whether we're talking, you used them both for, I don't care, knight or kings or AOS, I don't think you would see a difference on the table. And I don't think they would look odd next to each other in any way. Because from anything more than zoomed in on the models like we are here, they're going to look the same size. Right? All right. So now we get to the why, and I've already touched on a lot of these. But really, I think to sort of summarize why I think this is happening, larger models are easier to paint for the end user, number one. So hence, the person painting has a more positive experience and wants to keep buying your minis. If the miniatures are hard to assemble, hard to paint, it can ward people off of your game. It's a challenge with Malifaux. I love Malifaux to death. I collect their kits like it itself is a hobby because I think they're wonderfully beautiful, detailed sculpts. Who, by the way, are still in true 28mm, which can be a shock to people who are used to GW. But their models are incredibly complicated to put together in their new plastic sculpts, and they can be extremely fiddly. And I know plenty of people who've said no, they don't. They're not going to do it because they don't. It's not. They don't have the patience or the the eye for detail, right? And so it has a more positive user experience overall. That slight move in scale up to that 32-ish area allows the sculptor to include a lot more detail. And since a lot of these are done in CAD now, right, it also allows those things to be printed at a reasonable detail to where they could be painted. So the sculptor working in the computer has finer control than what somebody had when they were doing it, with their hand and putty and whatnot. But it's also meant that you can have these the CAD has also allowed these much more complex dynamic figures to get sort of broken up and parted out into plastic. So at all scales, there's plenty of games. Infinity and Malifaux are both still at 28mm, and they're pretty true 28mm. But even they have gotten to the point where they can make extremely detailed miniatures. But a lot of newer games as well have moved into this big 35mm. So the center is Wild West Exodus. Wild West Exodus, Night Games, who makes all the DC and Marvel heroes, those are all 35mm. So there's a lot of people exploring this larger space, right? Where somewhere within there, between 28 and 35mm, is where most of it is getting made now. Because that's sort of the space that's producing the best results with the combination of what we have with our modern tools, what people like to buy and paint, what we can include the right amount of detail on, and what works for the game in question, right? The more sort of the smaller your model count, the more it's a skirmish type game. You can, and the fewer figs you have on the table, you can afford to move the scale up just slightly, increase the detail, all this kind of stuff. So it has benefits. All right, conclusion time. It's not like models are going to get bigger and bigger forever until we're all playing with ogre-sized regular humans. If it was, we would simply be playing 54mm, which, by the way, there are 54mm games. There are plenty of them out there. They don't do very well. Because there's some kind of invisible line where models get where the difference, the bigger a model is, the longer it takes to paint, right? Okay. So there's some kind of weird line, some sort of equilibrium where the model gets too big to paint any amount of them en masse for a game. And so the added detail that you gain, that you can add on there. Like if you remember some of the old Inquisition, whatever, the 40K, what's it called? Inquisitor? Yeah, that's what the game is called. Figs. I love some of those models. They're freaking beautiful with their level of detail. But nobody really wants to collect. I mean, I've seen a few people do this and convert whole armies, but on the whole, nobody really wants to collect entire 54mm 40K armies, right? They don't want 40 Space Marines and 54mm size vehicles and everything scaling up like that. It's just a drop pod that would hold those things would be, the size of a drive around Tonka truck. Or I think that like an orc truck, there we go, at that scale would be like literally you just go out and steal your kid's little pedal truck and put it on the table. So there's just a line. I don't know what exactly it is, but it's probably above 35mm, right? That's probably somewhere around the ceiling where the fig gets as big as it can get, to where beyond that it's going to start getting too time consuming to paint, too big to have in any kind of number, and too just probably too expensive to produce as well, because those larger ones are also, the larger the model, the more material, there's a cost increase there. So what I would say is instead is that yes, there is scale creep. But what's happening is games are finding the scale that they like best and that works for their market. As I said, Malifaux and Infinity have stayed more or less true 28mm for the most part. And they seem to be doing just fine. At the same time, Games Workshop has moved up their models because of they want to be able to provide a level of detail on some miniatures. Like if you look at the like the Silver Tower miniatures, that more or less no other company producing en masse for games is doing. There's plenty of like boutique miniature makers who sculpt to that quality, but nobody else who's doing it in the number and the size and, dare I say, the scale that they are. And by the way, those models themselves, as I mentioned on the show, are no larger often than the old models. The Zangor, the Tzeentch Gore, are the exact size of the old Gore. And that Gore kit that's got to be more than 10 years old. I don't remember what year the Gore kit came out, but it's pretty old. I want to say early 2000s, when it moved to plastics from the old metal Gore. And they are sole to eyeline exactly the same height. So scale creep isn't a thing that is happening universally. We're not just going to keep getting bigger and bigger, and our armies aren't going to all work together and the apocalypse is coming. It's not going to be madness. Let's all cancel out the stress and relax, because in the end, these are going to move around and change in size here or there until these companies find the right equilibrium point. Some might still get a little bigger. It could happen. But like I said, there are companies producing above the scale of GW. Some, and, to whatever success or not. So there's plenty of people testing this to see where's the true golden mean for this. And so in my mind, I think we're probably right around where it is. Although you'll see plenty of bigger figs, monster figs that don't represent an increase in scale. They represent an increase in the size of that individual model. They're still scaled to 28 heroic or 32 effectively, right? They're just bigger because they are more special in the world. In the same way the Bloodthirster grew over time, so too will you see like a special, like the Varangard, being just bigger, scarier Chaos Knights. Because each of them is effectively a big hero, so they need to stand out, right? So there you go. That's my thoughts on scale creep. I hope you enjoyed. My basic point is, I think that the slightly larger minis are awesome. As somebody who paints a lot of like 32 scale and up, I will say that the difference is the difference between the amount of stress I have trying to paint a 32 or 35 millimeter mini to a high quality versus a 28. It's noticeable. So I appreciate it. I hope you all enjoyed. If you did, if you're not already subscribed, give us a subscribe, give us a like. And as always, we'll see you next time.